You're looking at preliminary data analysis, which is the analysis that you do while you actually collect the data. And you have to remember that, because when we look at thematic analysis, it can be confusing. In the next session, when we do thematic analysis, you'll understand that we do that when the data is all in. So the issues that we're going to have a look at today are transcription and what that might look at. So that's turning your recording into something that you can then analyse, which is written down. And preliminary data analysis is this process that we're going to look at more closely. So let's look at what a transcription might look like. And here's one researcher who's out in the field interviewing ministers about what is a eulogy, is his major question. Now I've just put that up there so you can just see how he's put it onto the page. And it's totally idiosyncratic. I tend to put mine far to the left-hand side of the page and leave a fairly large column on the right to do my data analysis. He likes to leave a column on the left where he's going to write some other stuff, and on the right he'll put his data analysis. So it's entirely what works for you, but somehow you've got to leave at least a column of a reasonable width somewhere along the line so that you can actually do your preliminary data analysis process. Let's see what the purpose of preliminary data analysis actually is. It's firstly to keep track of the data while you're collecting it, so you don't end up with a whole room full of data and you have absolutely no idea what's in it. And that's pretty much a sort of nervous breakdown type situation. But it's also to, as you collect each bit of data, it's part of that iterative process, that recursive spiral, where as soon as you collect some data from the field, you have to make sense of it. You have to find out whether you've got all the data. And you need to know whether you need to follow up with that person and what you need to do in terms of asking further questions further down the track. So here's what this particular researcher with the eulogy study has ended up with. And you can see on the left-hand column in the yellow font, he's actually written a critique of his own performance. He's looking at the questions, he's looking at the style of interview, he's looking at whether or not the person that he's interviewing is actually talking or whether it's he that's dominating the conversation. And all that he's got down there has indicated that things are going pretty well. Questions are good, the interviewee is doing all the talking. On the right-hand side then we've got the preliminary data analysis, which is him questioning the data and finding out where the holes were in the whole process, which are not always evident until you actually transcribe the data, because you're so busy running the interview, you're totally focused on what the next question's going to be and where you're going to go. You can see what he's done down there is indicate that he's not actually all that clear about what a eulogy is, and he didn't realise it could be done for people who are actually alive as well as for people who are dead. So, okay, that's going to perhaps change the way he asks that question. And then he continues on down to put up some questions of the data. He identifies things like ritual and rite of passage, which are important to him in his discipline and perhaps going to become theoretical concepts that he's going to follow, and so on. And he'll continue that process right through. So where does he need to follow up? What's missing? And maybe just a little bit of moving almost into putting the data into the next area, which is the discussion using some sort of theory. And when he's done all that, so it doesn't lose track of what's in this particular interview, he does what's called a face sheet. And the face sheet has a whole list of identifiers there. Who's this person? How old are they? Any information about them? When was the interview actually done? How long was that interview? And you can see it was an hour and a half, with about a half an hour and then another 45 minutes afterwards. So it's a fairly lengthy process that he's been in the field, probably a cup of coffee at both ends. Any other information that he needs to put down relevant to the person he's interviewing. He's noted he obviously hasn't had a signed form, but on the tape permission to be interviewed has actually been gathered. He likes to do a diagram down the bottom of where he's sitting and where the other person's sitting. A lot of interviewers don't bother to do that, but they do that when they do an observation because they move around a setting. Now here's another example of a researcher who is investigating case studies of primary caregiver males to see how they're experiencing the role in terms of other people's view of them in the role. And he's this particular person is talking about injustice, so the researcher immediately pulls that one out and says, oh, okay, what's all this about? I need to follow up on this. I need to maybe talk to the other people in the study about whether they feel that injustice has been done to them. And he's made a statement about, men actually prefer to be in the breadwinner role rather than the home caring role. So he wants to check that out and say, does it vary if they are part-time workers? Does it make them feel different? Or if they're the sole person at home, would they prefer to be out in the workforce? So he's going to check that out with other people in the study. And so it goes on. So it's questioning the data, coming up with some sort of conclusion and following on. Now, where does he go with all of this? So you can see what he's got now is a complete face sheet, which is the thing you just staple to the front of your interview or your observation transcript. And it's again got all the information about who the person is. Pseudonyms are used when the interview is done, any other information about other people present, place, time, and so forth. And then he's got some dot points under that, which are issues emerging and issues to be followed up. And so that's his checklist. So he'll either follow up by ringing that person after a while when they've got a copy of the transcript and saying, there are a few things I'd like to follow up from this interview, or he'll take some of those key things that have emerged and feed them into the next interview and then the next, so that each interview actually ends up with slightly different questions or more in detail questions. Now, if you can manage to do that in your assignment, that would be fantastic in terms of the feeding in, but the face sheets and the transcripts and the issues arising have to be done by you for every piece of data that you collect. Sometimes people do what are called dataset summaries. As they're going, they start to put the data together into sort of little blocks. And this is a study of students who have some sort of mental disability who are being integrated into school classrooms, and the researchers deciding that these kids are actually fairly much in control of the way they expose the situation that they're in and how they manage that in terms of other kids when they're interacting with them. So they've decided to write a bit about that. So this is actually an emerging theme which is coming out of the data. And as they add more data and collect more data, it may shift and change, or it may stay and become a fairly permanent theme. Here again from the primary caregiver study, you can see that the perceptions of other people are also starting to be collected after about 5 interviews out of, say, 25. He's starting to write up, these are the key sorts of interactions that people tend to be having with these guys. I think I'll start documenting them and just putting them together, keeping them fairly intact, because it will be useful to have that, and that may well become a major theme in its own right, or it may just be something I just keep aside. Now, not all researchers do this kind of summary performance. Some just undergo preliminary data analysis, develop their face sheets and their issues emerging, and move on to the next interview and perhaps do some follow-up. So if we're to summarise what you actually need to do here, well, firstly you need to work out how you're going to organise your transcript. You need to undertake that particular transcript, leaving a column, whether it's an observation transcript or whether it is an interview transcript, so that you can question the data in this very active way, so that you can work out where you need to go and how you need to follow up, and what are the major issues, which will probably soon become the themes that you're collecting are starting to pan out. So identify all your areas of follow-up, and then in this way you're able to keep track of your data. Thank you. Right, this session is about thematic analysis, which, as I said before in the last session, preliminary data analysis is when you're collecting data. Thematic analysis is when all that data is in and you actually need to identify the themes. So that's the purpose of it. There are 2 approaches to it, and it really depends on the kind of data that you've got. If you've got really intact, long answers, stories that people have told you, you may want to keep that data largely intact. You might want to edit it down a bit in order to display it in your results section. But the suggestion is that that data sort of begs to be left intact. And that's called the block, group and label approach. Now, sometimes you have data which is not so in depth and not such large stories which are really intact. And you'll undergo a very similar process, but you actually will look at much thinner data. So let's start with the intact data and see how that might look. Firstly, you've got to identify which are the stories. Now, sometimes they are responses to questions. As you've asked a question, you've got the story. And right across all the interviews you've done, you've got that story or those stories, which are probably all different, just following the question. But sometimes when you look through the data, you'll find that the people have gone back to that question, or it's tucked into another response. So the data isn't always in response to a question. It sometimes just feeds into the rest of the database, which means you have to have read all of your database before you start doing this to make some sense of it. So you identify the bits that are important, that seem to be all about this particular topic, and then you start blocking them. You can do a cut and paste, put them into a particular file, but most people tend to start putting them into columns because they want to compare across the columns and to label those columns. But let's just take the process from the beginning. So here we've got a question about when did they decide to stay home. We're back on the primary caregiver study. And here we've got 5 out of the 25 responses, which in this particular study have all followed the question. But as I said, watch out because sometimes that doesn't happen. And they're all being listed, so they're sort of being cut and pasted out of the interviews, and they're being put into columns. And sometimes you'll get quite a few responses in one column and maybe only 1 or 2 in others. So you go through and look at your columns and make sure you've got sort of something fairly similar so that you can start to match them up. And then you'll put headings on those columns, and they almost become themes or sub-themes with regard to that particular question about the decision to stay home. So there are obviously different kinds of decisions which are made under different kinds of circumstances, and that's what you'll state in your results section, and then you'll go through, indicate the different kinds, and perhaps give an example of each one. So really it's just identifying across the database all the relevant bits and then grouping them, labelling them, and then working out whether they're themes or sub-themes relating to the question that you've asked. Other ways of doing it, when you've got data that isn't large intact stories but has lots of bits and pieces in it, you might decide just to go through and identify by colour coding or by underlining what you think the major bits of it are in relation to your question, again, that you've just asked. So that might be one process. Here is the segmented data approach to a question of what do you think about homelessness, and the person's gone through and just pulled out all the major key words which they feel are a response to that particular question. So they've listed them, then they've put them, so taking the process very slowly, then they've put them into columns, and some of those columns, they don't seem to fit very well, and they look as though they might just be a sort of a waiting column to see what else is going to emerge. And some of them look as though they might need to be further developed. So we've got problem, we've got uncertainty, something to do with emotion, something to do with passing it on to the government and delegation, something to do with the experience of living on the street and what that might be about. And then we've got a few that just somehow don't seem to fit anywhere at this point. So as you continue on through the responses to that question, these columns will start to get heavier and heavier, and some of them are going to shift and change. For example, the first one there, problem and terrible, although they were close together in terms of the interview, it's not sure whether they're going to stay there or whether that'll move into some form of emotional response, which may be a more general kind of theme that's going to emerge. So it's a matter of playing with these columns. The most important thing is once you've identified, say, half a dozen columns, that you don't force all the remaining data into those, thinking, oh, it doesn't quite fit, but hey, it'll sort of go there. These are very flexible working columns, and they should continually change right through till you get to the end of all the interviews that you're looking at or the observations that you're looking at. Okay, now some people don't like to think in columns, they prefer to think in conceptual maps, and Kidspiration is just one of the freeware programs that you can download for 30 days if you want to borrow it. It's up on one of the education sites, and you can then just start putting them together in that sort of way, attaching the various bits to other bits that are relevant to the question about homelessness. It's good for a quick overview. The problem with conceptual maps might be that as you get more data, each bit's going to get heavier and heavier until you're going to have to go into different conceptual maps, maybe one about people's responses, maybe one about what the government is or isn't doing, maybe one about the experience of homelessness for the people who are homeless. So you've actually got different areas which will then develop into different conceptual maps and become different themes and sub-themes of the question of people's views on homelessness. So just to summarise this, you can see that thematic analysis is a way of putting all your data, once it's already into meaningful themes and sub-themes, which are then going to move on to your results section. And while you're going through that, you're obviously identifying some of the best stories or the best quotes, which you're going to highlight because you might want to use them for display in your results section. So think about that too. Preliminary data analysis, just as you're collecting that data, so don't mix those two up. And the processes of colour coding, underlining, developing columns or conceptual maps are all wide open for you to use. Again, it's idiosyncratic, just do whatever works for you. Thank you.